The morning Maria Grady climbed those courthouse steps alone, the dust of Caldwell, Kansas was still cool beneath her boots, and the whole town believed she was walking to her own ruin. It was the autumn of 1882, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a bead on a fraying string full of cattle drovers, gamblers, railroad men, and the kind of desperate souls who had run out of road everywhere else. The town had seen its share of trouble, its share of blood spilled in the dirt outside saloons, its share of women left alone with nothing but a deed to some hard-scrabble land and children who asked too many questions she couldn't answer. Maria Grady was one of those women, except she was not the kind to shrink from the questions or from the silence that followed them. She was 28 years old, dark-haired, dark-eyed, with the kind of face that had once been described by her late husband as looking like the land itself, strong and quietly beautiful and capable of surviving drought. She had not taken that as the romantic compliment Thomas Grady had intended, but she had understood what he meant. She was not fragile. She had never been fragile. Thomas had been dead for 14 months. He had ridden out one Saturday morning to settle a land dispute with Harlan Dole, the wealthiest rancher in Sumner County, and he had come back draped over the saddle of his own horse. The official story, the story Judge Amos Whitfield had written down in the county record, was that Thomas Grady had been found dead of a fall from his horse near Rattlesnake Creek. Maria had looked at her husband's broken body and known, with the kind of bone-deep certainty that doesn't require a lawyer or a jury, that Thomas had not fallen from any horse. Thomas Grady had ridden since he was 4 years old. He had broken horses that would have killed most men twice over. He did not fall. But Harlan Dole had Judge Whitfield in his pocket, had 3/4 of the county commissioners in his pocket, and owned enough land on both sides of the Kansas Indian Territory border to make questioning him a matter of personal safety. So Maria had buried her husband, raised her son, planted her fields, and waited. She was not waiting out of cowardice. She was waiting because she needed proof, and because in 1882, a widow's word against a cattle baron's was worth approximately nothing in a court of law. The proof had come 4 days ago in the form of a stranger. Noah Thatcher had ridden into Caldwell on a gray horse with mud up to his fetlocks, and a reputation that had preceded him by about 3 counties. He was known, variously, as a horse thief, a card sharp, a man who had ridden briefly with the Doolin gang before some falling out that nobody could quite corroborate, and a general disruption to the peace wherever he appeared. He was 33 years old, lean and brown from years under an open sky, with dark blonde hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of the creek in September, that particular shade of green-gray that belongs only to moving water. He wore his Colt low on his hip and walked like a man who had learned that the world rewarded readiness over comfort. Maria had hated him on sight, or rather, she had hated what he represented. She had spent 14 months trying to make her life and her son's life respectable, manageable, safe. She had accepted the charity of neighbors with iron dignity. She had kept her land when Dole's men had tried to fence it off. She had sent her son, 8-year-old James, to the schoolhouse every morning and made sure he had clean clothes and a full stomach, even on the mornings she went hungry herself. She had done all of this by being careful, by being above reproach, by being the kind of woman the town could not dismiss. And Noah Thatcher was precisely the kind of man who made careful women's careful lives fall apart. He had come to her door on a Tuesday evening, hat in hand, which surprised her because she had not expected manners from a man with his reputation. She had answered the door with her rifle, which surprised him, though he had not stepped back. "Mrs. Grady," he said. His voice was quiet and level. "I heard you've been looking for proof about your husband." She had kept the rifle steady. "Who told you that?" "Doesn't matter who told me. What matters is that I have it." She had not put the rifle down. Men who show up after dark with information usually want something in return. He had looked at her, then really looked at her, not the way men usually looked at her, cataloging her as a widow, as a vulnerability, as something that could be used, but with a kind of frank assessment, as though he were trying to determine if she was capable of handling what he had to say. "I want the same thing you want," he said. "Harlan Dole ruined. I'm not going to pretend it's purely noble on my part. He cost me something too." "What did he cost you?" 3 years of my life and a good man's reputation. She had let him in, eventually. Not because she trusted him. She did not trust him, but because she was running out of time. Dole had filed new papers with the county court claiming that Thomas Grady had died without a valid deed to the Grady land, and that under some convoluted reading of the county records, the property should revert to a neighboring tract that Dole just happened to own. The hearing was set for Friday morning, which was now just 3 days away. Noah Thatcher sat at her kitchen table and told her a story. He told it plainly, without embellishment, and she listened with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on his face. He had been in Dole's employ 3 years ago, briefly, as a horse handler. He had not known, at the time, what kind of man he was working for. He had found out the night he witnessed 2 of Dole's men, a pair of brothers named Cutter, Lyle and Pete Cutter, ride out with Thomas Grady under duress. He had heard the argument. He had heard Dole's voice carrying from the barn, telling the Cutter brothers that Thomas Grady was a problem that needed permanent solving. He had been young and not yet wise enough to understand that witnessing something made him a liability rather than a witness, and by the time he understood that, the Cutter brothers had made it clear he would follow Thomas Grady to the creek if he opened his mouth. He had run. He had spent 3 years being called an outlaw, a drifter, a criminal, partly because men like Dole had enough reach to dirty a man's name from a distance, and partly because running from something long enough starts to look like guilt to anyone watching. "Why come forward now?" Maria asked. Her voice was steady. Her heart was not. "Because I'm tired of running," he said, "and because I heard Dole is about to take your land, and because your husband didn't deserve what happened to him." She studied him for a long time. She was good at reading people. Life had made her good at it, and what she read in Noah Thatcher was not the easy false sincerity of a man performing honesty for an audience. It was the harder, more complicated truth of a man who had done things he regretted and was trying in his imperfect way to make something right. "If you testify," she said, "Dole will come after you. I expect so. You understand the risk." "Mrs. Grady," he said, and there was something in the way he said her name, not unkindly but with a kind of respect that she had not heard from a man in a very long time. "I've been living with the risk for 3 years. The difference is that now I get to choose it." She had not slept that night. She had lain in her bed listening to James breathe in the next room and stared at the ceiling and thought about Thomas, about the sound his name made in her mouth now. How it still hurt, but differently than it had in the early months, less like fresh tearing and more like scar tissue being stretched. She thought about the land, about the fields she and Thomas had planted together, about the kitchen garden she had kept alive through the past summer by sheer stubborn watering. She thought about James growing up on land that was his by right, land his father had died for, even if nobody was supposed to say so. And she thought, more than she intended to, about Noah Thatcher sitting across her kitchen table with his hat turning slowly in his hands, and his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had been judged for too long. The next 2 days were a blur of necessity. Maria went to see Aldous Bennett, the only lawyer in Caldwell who was not already in Dole's pocket, and found him willing to take her case on the condition that she could produce a credible witness. Noah went with her. Bennett questioned him for 2 hours, circling back on details, testing for inconsistency, and Noah answered everything directly and completely. Bennett sat back in his chair afterward with the expression of a man who has just found an unexpected trump card and said, "Well, Mrs. Grady, I believe we have a case." The town noticed, of course. Towns like Caldwell always noticed. By Wednesday evening, people were talking about the widow and the outlaw, and the land case against Dole with the eager, breathless energy of people who live close to the edge of things and recognize when something significant is about to tip. Some people were sympathetic. Most of them were simply curious in the way that people are when other people's troubles become spectacle. A woman named Ruth Abernathy, who ran the dry goods store and had been Maria's closest friend since Thomas died, pulled Maria aside on Wednesday afternoon and said very quietly, "Maria, you know what people are saying." "I know what people are saying," Maria said. "They're saying you've thrown in with a criminal, that this Thatcher is going to make things worse, not better. That Dole will have you both run out of town before the hearing." "Dole can try," Maria said. Ruth studied her. "You trust him." "This Thatcher," Maria thought about it honestly. "I trust that he wants Dole answered for. I trust that his account is accurate. Beyond that," she paused. "I don't know him well enough to trust him more than that. But you're going to let him testify?" "Yes. And if it goes wrong?" Maria picked up the bolt of calico she had come in to buy, not because she needed calico, but because she needed something ordinary to hold onto, and said, "Then it goes wrong. But I'm not going to let Thomas's death get filed away as a riding accident because I was afraid of what people might think about who helped me." She walked out of the store and did not look back, but she felt Ruth watching her go, and she felt, too, the weight of the town's attention like a second shadow she carried. Wednesday night, Dole's men paid Noah a visit. Two of them at the boarding house where he was staying on the edge of town. Maria found out about it Thursday morning when she came to meet him and saw the split along his jawline and the careful way he was holding his right shoulder. "I'm fine," he said before she could speak. "They were warning you off," she said. "They were. It didn't take." She looked at him for a moment, at the bruise along his jaw, at the steadiness in his eyes despite it, and felt something she had not expected to feel, a fierce, protective anger. Not pity. Not the soft sympathy she might have felt toward a man she regarded as an instrument of her case. Something more personal than that, and it alarmed her. "You should have somewhere safer to sleep," she said before she had entirely thought about what she was saying. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, surprised, careful, something else beneath that. "Are you offering your barn, Mrs. Grady?" "I'm offering the loft above the barn. It locks from the inside. And my nearest neighbor is Jim Kowalski, who does not like Dole and keeps a rifle by his door." "That is a practical arrangement," he said. "It is entirely practical," she agreed. And if there was a slight heat in her face when she said it, she attributed it to the morning sun. He moved to her barn that afternoon, and James, who was at that particular age where every stranger represented a potentially magnificent disruption of routine, came home from school to find a man in the loft and interrogated Noah with the thoroughgoing thoroughness of an 8-year-old who has been his mother's only male company for over a year. "Are you a real outlaw?" James demanded, climbing the ladder to the loft without invitation. Noah looked at him with the kind of seriousness children deserve but rarely get from adults. "I've been called one," he said. "I've done some things I'm not proud of. I've also been blamed for some things I didn't do." The truth is usually somewhere in between the story people tell and the story the person lives. James considered this with great solemnity. "My mother says the same thing about people. She says the newspaper only prints half the truth. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She is. She also says you're going to help us keep our land." "I'm going to try." James nodded with the decisive satisfaction of a child who has received an acceptable answer. "My father would have liked you," he said, and then climbed back down the ladder with the lightness of someone who has said the most important thing in the room and now has other places to be. Maria was standing at the barn door. She had heard everything. She turned away before Noah could see her face. That evening, after James was in bed, she brought a plate of food out to the barn. It was unnecessary. She had already left him supper at the usual time, but she found herself with the plate in her hands anyway, standing in the autumn dark listening to the horses shift in their stalls and the distant sounds of Caldwell settling into night. She climbed the ladder. He was sitting on the cot she had set up for him, reading by lamplight. It surprised her. She had not thought of him as a reading man. "What is it?" she asked, nodding at the book. He turned it so she could see the cover, David Copperfield. She felt something shift in her chest, some small reordering of the way she had been holding herself in relation to him. "I've had a long time to read," he said. "Writing alone gives you either too much thinking or too much reading. I chose reading." She sat down on the wooden crate that served as a makeshift chair, which she did not entirely intend to do. "What happened to you?" she asked. "Before Dole, before all of this." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of evasion, but the quiet of a man deciding how honestly to answer a question that deserves honesty. "I grew up in Missouri," he said. "My father had a farm. He lost it. There were a lot of ways to lose a farm in Missouri in the 1860s and 1870s, and he found most of them. I left when I was 17. Worked cattle, worked horses, worked anything that needed working. I wasn't a criminal. I wasn't virtuous either. I was just a man trying to find the shape of his own life and not finding it very easily." "And Dole?" she asked. "Dole was supposed to be a steady job. He had a good operation on the surface. Clean stalls, good horses, decent wages. I didn't ask questions I should have asked. By the time I understood the kind of operation it actually was, he stopped, set the book down. I told you about your husband, but there were other things. Other men, men whose land he wanted or whose silence he needed. I didn't witness all of it, but I understood enough. And I ran, and I've been running, and every time I think I've gotten far enough away, I hear another story about what he's done, and I feel." He stopped again. "Responsible," Maria said quietly. "Yes." She looked at him. He was looking at the lamp, at the small flame turning inside the glass chimney. In the lamplight, with the roughness of the bruise along his jaw and the book open beside him, he looked less like the man the town had described, dangerous, unpredictable, an agent of chaos, and more like what he actually was, a person who had been worn down by circumstance and was attempting against some odds to recover himself. "I don't hold you responsible for Thomas," she said, and she meant it. "You were young, and Dole is a powerful man. Fear is not the same as complicity." He looked at her then. "You're kinder than I expected," he said, "given that you met me at gunpoint." "I'm not kind," she said. "I'm accurate. There's a difference." He smiled, a real smile, not the careful, controlled expression she had seen from him in daylight, but something that reached his eyes and changed his whole face. It was brief, gone almost as quickly as it arrived, but she saw it and felt it like a small stone dropped into still water, the ring spreading outward in ways she hadn't anticipated. She went back to the house before she could say anything else she hadn't planned on saying. Thursday was tense and purposeful. Aldous Bennett met with them in the morning to go over Noah's testimony. He would testify about what he had witnessed at Dole's ranch, the argument, the Cutter brothers riding out with Thomas, the clear implication of intent. He had a letter, too, that he had written down 2 years ago and had witnessed by a reverend in a small town in Oklahoma Territory, describing what he had seen, dated and signed and stored with the church records as a kind of insurance against exactly this moment. Bennett's eyes brightened considerably when Noah produced this letter. "This changes things significantly," Bennett said. "I know," Noah said. "Dole will contest it. He'll try. Judge Whitfield will be on the bench. He is not a friend to anyone going against Dole. You understand that testimony alone may not be enough to secure a criminal finding today, but it will absolutely be enough to prevent Dole from claiming the land. And once the land claim is defeated, we can petition the circuit court for a proper criminal investigation." "I understand," Maria said. "I need the land first. My son needs the land first. The rest," she paused. "The rest will follow if it follows." Bennett nodded. Then he looked at them both across his desk with the expression of a man who has spent enough time in frontier courtrooms to recognize when people are about to walk into something larger than they've planned for. "There is going to be a great deal of attention on that courtroom tomorrow," he said. "Dole's men will be there. His lawyer, Marcus Cole, is formidable. And the town will be watching, which cuts both ways. Public attention is some protection, but it is also pressure." "We understand," Maria said. She did not sleep Thursday night either. She lay awake going over every possible outcome, every counterargument Dole's lawyer might make, every moment where her evidence might be picked apart or her witness dismissed. She admitted to herself in the small, honest hours of the night, frightened. Not of failing, or not only of failing, but of something more complicated. She was frightened of what happened after. If they won, if she kept the land, if Noah's testimony held, what then? What did her life look like? It had been organized entirely around survival for over a year, and she could see the shape of surviving, could manage its demands. But thriving was a different and more uncertain country. And then, below that thought, quieter and less comfortable, was another thought entirely. She recognized that Noah Thatcher had come to matter to her in a way that had nothing to do with the land case. She recognized this and promptly buried it under several layers of practicality, because they were 18 hours away from a courthouse, and this was not the time. She rose before dawn. She dressed carefully, in the best dress she owned, dark blue wool, simply cut, the kind of dress that said, "I am serious and I deserve to be taken seriously," without saying anything else. She brushed her hair and pinned it up and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and thought about Thomas for a moment, about the morning he had ridden out, about the way he had kissed her on the cheek at the door, about the terrible ordinary casualness of last moments. Then she set Thomas down in the part of her heart where she kept things that were precious and finished and not to be disturbed, and she turned away from the mirror. James was still sleeping. She had arranged for Ruth Abernathy to watch him during the hearing. Ruth had agreed without hesitation, with the quiet efficiency of a good friend who understands that sometimes help means not asking too many questions. The courthouse was on Main Street, a two-story stone building that Caldwell had built in 1880 with considerable civic pride, and that now served as the symbolic center of whatever order the town managed to maintain. In 1882, that order was imperfect, contested, and perpetually under negotiation. But the building itself was solid, and the steps leading up to the double doors were wide and well laid, gray limestone worn smooth at the center by 5 years of boot traffic. Maria walked those steps alone in the gray light just before dawn, the town still mostly sleeping around her, her breath making small clouds in the cool autumn air. She was thinking about the day ahead, about Bennett's arguments, about the documents they had assembled, and she was thinking, too, she could admit this about Noah. She had left him in the barn with instructions to arrive at the courthouse by 7 o'clock, and she half expected him to be late, or not to arrive at all, because she was still, despite everything, not entirely certain he would stay. She reached the top step and stopped. Noah Thatcher was already there. He was standing at the courthouse door, his hand on the iron handle, holding it open. He had cleaned up new shirt, his hair pushed back, the bruise along his jaw a dusky yellow now, fading. He was watching her come up the steps with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, something steady and deliberate and warm. And when she reached the top and stopped in front of him, he said simply, "Good morning, Mrs. Grady." She looked at him. She thought about all the things she had believed about men like him, rootless men, troubled men, men whose pasts were complicated and whose futures were uncertain. She thought about how carefully she had constructed her life around reliability and respectability and the quiet armor of being above reproach. She thought about how he was already holding the door. "You're early," she said. "I've been early for 3 years," he said, and there was something in those words that meant much more than just this morning. Thought I'd finally let it count for something. She walked through the door he was holding, and felt the warmth of the building close around her, and felt something else close around her too, something less definable but equally real, like the beginning of something she hadn't planned on but was beginning to suspect she needed. The courtroom filled quickly. Caldwell was a town that ran on spectacle and drama, and the Grady land case had developed, over the past 3 days, into the finest piece of theater available. The benches were filled with ranchers and shopkeepers and cowboys and women from the church auxiliary, and 3 railroad men who had no stake in the matter but sat in the back with their arms folded, as if sitting in judgment on the judgment itself. Harlan Dole came in with his lawyer, Marcus Cole, and 3 men who were technically ranch hands but who had the particular watchful stillness of men kept for reasons other than cattle. Dole himself was a big man, 60 years old, with the well-fed self-assurance of someone who had been the most powerful person in a room for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like not to be. He saw Maria and Noah sitting at the plaintiff's table, and his eyes moved over them with a flat, contemptuous assessment. And then he sat down and said something to Marcus Cole that made Cole glance over his shoulder and smile in the way that expensive lawyers smile when they are confident of the outcome. Judge Whitfield entered. He was a small, neat man with silver hair and a manner of grave procedural solemnity that he wore like a costume. He looked at the full courtroom with mild surprise. He had not expected this level of attendance, and then he sat and called the court to order. Bennett presented the case clearly and with more fire than Maria had expected from him. He laid out the land deed, Thomas Grady's legitimate ownership, the circumstances of his death, the suspicious timing of Dole's claim, and the existence of a witness. Cole objected repeatedly, questioned the validity of the deed on technical grounds, and suggested twice that the whole proceeding was motivated by a grieving widow's inability to accept the tragic accident of her husband's death. Each time Cole said the word accident, Maria kept her hands flat on the table and her expression composed, and she felt Noah, seated beside her, go very still in the way that controlled people go still when they are managing something powerful. Noah was called to testify. He walked to the witness stand with the same unhurried steadiness with which he did everything, and he sat down, and he told the court, in plain and precise language, exactly what he had witnessed 3 years ago at Harlan Dole's ranch. He described the conversation. He described the Cutter brothers riding out with Thomas Grady. He described Dole's voice, the specific words. He produced, through Bennett, the letter he had written and witnessed in Oklahoma Territory, dated 18 months before today's hearing. Cole came at him hard. He questioned Noah's character, his history, his time riding with the Doolin gang, a charge Noah neither denied nor elaborated on, simply saying that he had ridden with some men he later regretted knowing, and that this had no bearing on what his eyes had seen at Dole's ranch. Cole questioned why he had waited 3 years to come forward. Noah said that he had spent 3 years afraid for his life, and that he was still afraid for his life, but that some things mattered more than personal safety. Cole suggested that Noah had been paid by Maria Grady to fabricate testimony. Noah looked at the lawyer with steady green-gray eyes and said that he had received nothing from Mrs. Grady except supper and the use of a barn loft, and that the suggestion was an insult to a woman who had more integrity than every man in this courtroom combined. There was a stir in the benches. Maria did not look away from the witness stand. Judge Whitfield, to his credit, and Maria suspected this was mostly because the courtroom was full of witnesses, and Caldwell was the kind of town where a story traveled fast, ruled that the land deed was valid and that Dole's claim was dismissed. He also noted, in language that was carefully but unmistakably pointed, that the testimony given today raised serious questions that warranted further investigation by the county sheriff, and if necessary, the circuit court. It was not a full victory. Dole was not arrested that day, not charged, not led away in irons. Maria had known it was unlikely that the criminal matter would be resolved in a land hearing, and she had known that Whitfield would not go further than the evidence absolutely required. But the land was hers. The claim was dismissed. The record now contained Noah's testimony and the witness letter, and that record was public, and Marcus Cole's confident smile had been replaced by something more guarded. Maria walked out of the courthouse into the October sunlight and stood on the top step and breathed. The air tasted clean and cool, and full of the particular relief that follows prolonged tension, the way a held breath feels when you finally let it go. Ruth Abernathy was outside, having apparently given up on waiting at home for news. She grabbed Maria's hands and squeezed them hard. Bennett came out behind Maria and said that they would begin the petition to the circuit court next week. A number of townspeople who had been inside came out and offered congratulations with varying degrees of warmth, some genuinely happy, some simply thrilled to have witnessed Dole's public check, and a few who looked at Maria with the particular cautious approval of people who have revised their opinion of someone and are not quite ready to admit it. Dole walked past her on the steps without looking at her, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. His men followed. One of them, not the Cutter brothers, who had apparently left Dole's employ some time ago under circumstances nobody seemed willing to specify, looked back at Noah with a long, flat stare. Noah watched him go without expression. When the crowd had thinned, Maria turned to Noah. He was standing slightly apart from the others, his hat in his hand again, that gesture she had already come to associate with him, the hat in the hand, the small act of exposure. He looked tired, not the tired of a man who hasn't slept, but the tired of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just set it down and doesn't quite know what to do with his hands now. "Thank you," she said. The words were entirely insufficient, and she knew it. "You would have fought it with or without me," he said. "Yes," she said, "but with you I won, that matters." He nodded. He looked out at the street, at the town going about its morning, at the horses at the hitching rails and the smoke coming from the blacksmith's chimney and the ordinary persistent life of a frontier town. He looked like a man deciding something. "I'll ride out today," he said. "I don't want to cause more trouble for you here than I already have." Maria felt the thing she had been refusing to name all week rise up and name itself without her permission. "Where will you go?" she asked. Her voice was level. She was good at level. He shrugged slightly. "West, probably. There's always work somewhere west." "Is that what you want, more west?" He looked at her then. The morning sun was full on his face, and she could see him clearly, not the reputation or the story the town told about him, but the man himself. The man who read David Copperfield by lamplight and spoke to her son with perfect seriousness, and had been holding the courthouse door at dawn because he was the kind of person who showed up early for things that mattered. "No," he said quietly. "It's not what I want, but what I want and what's sensible are often different things." "They are," she agreed. "But sensible is sometimes just another word for afraid." He looked at her with that careful, watchful look, and she held it, not dropping her eyes, not retreating behind the composed surface she maintained so thoroughly. "Mrs. Grady," he said, "I am a man with a complicated history and no fixed address in a county full of people who think I'm a criminal." "I know what you are," she said. "I've read the man, not the newspaper story. I told you I'm accurate." The silence stretched between them, full and taut and warm. "I have a barn loft that needs occupying," she said, "and fields that need putting to bed for winter, and a boy who asked me this morning whether you would still be here when he got home from school today." She paused. "I told him I didn't know. I would like to be able to tell him something more definite." Noah looked at her for a long time. She could see him working through it, the risk and the wanting and the difficulty of trusting that wanting was enough of a reason. "A barn loft is not much of an inducement," he said finally, but the corner of his mouth was doing something that was almost a smile. "The barn loft is temporary," she said. "Everything starts as temporary." He put his hat back on his head with a deliberate motion and looked at her and said, "I'll be there when James gets home from school." She nodded. She walked down the courthouse steps and onto the street, and she did not let herself smile until she had turned the corner toward home. The next weeks were a revelation of small, ordinary things. Noah was, it turned out, extraordinarily useful. He understood horses with an intimacy that bordered on conversation, could diagnose a lame animal's problem by watching it walk across a yard, could calm a spooked horse with a particular low murmuring that Maria found herself listening to from the kitchen window far longer than was strictly necessary. He turned out the fields for winter with a quiet efficiency that made Maria's already competent work look merely adequate. He repaired the fence line on the north side of the property that had been slowly losing the argument against the Kansas wind since the previous spring. He found the weak boards in the barn roof and replaced them before the first serious rain, which came in early November and would have otherwise been a catastrophe. He was careful. He was careful about her reputation, about the town's perception of their arrangement. He slept in the barn loft, kept a respectful distance in public, referred to her as Mrs. Grady to anyone who might be listening. He understood without her having to explain it, the particular vulnerability of a widow standing in a small frontier town, where the line between respectable and suspect was narrow and unforgiving, and crossed mostly by other people's tongues. But in the evenings, when James was settled with his schoolwork at the kitchen table and the lamp was turned low, and the sound of the wind came through the walls of the house, Maria sometimes brought her mending to the porch, and Noah sometimes came and sat on the steps, and they talked. They talked about everything about Thomas, eventually, about the farm in Missouri Noah had grown up on, about the war's long shadow over the Western territories, about books, about the kind of country they both hoped this land would become one day, about James's talent for arithmetic and his stubbornness about geography. She learned that he was funny, which surprised her. Dry and quiet and watchful, but when he found something genuinely amusing, he laughed with his whole chest, and it was one of the best sounds she had heard in a long time. She learned that he could not cook anything that required more than one pot, and that he ate whatever she set in front of him with unreserved appreciation, which she found more endearing than was reasonable. She learned that he was patient in a way that was not passive patient the way a good craftsman is patient, because he understood that things done well take the time they take. She also learned that the circuit court investigation that Bennett had petitioned for was making progress. The county sheriff, a man named Ira Pells who had been quietly uncomfortable with the Whitfield-Dole arrangement for years, had apparently seen the packed courthouse and the public record of Noah's testimony as sufficient cover to begin an actual investigation. He had ridden out to find the Cutter brothers, which was the key action. Pete Cutter, it emerged in early December, had been living quietly in a town 40 miles southeast, and had been carrying a considerable amount of guilt about Thomas Grady for 14 months. When Sheriff Pells arrived with a warrant and the information that there was already sworn testimony on record, Pete Cutter decided that talking was preferable to hanging and gave a full statement. Lyle Cutter was located 2 weeks after that, in the Indian Territory, and was brought back to Sumner County under arrest. Harlan Dole was indicted on charges of conspiracy to commit murder on the 14th of December, 1882. He was arrested at his ranch by Sheriff Pells and 2 deputies, and the news reached Caldwell before Dole himself did, traveling the way news always traveled in frontier towns, at the speed of someone who had seen it and couldn't wait to tell someone who hadn't. Maria heard the news from Ruth Abernathy, who came to the door in the middle of the afternoon with her coat not fully buttoned, and her face flushed with something that was not quite excitement and not quite relief, but something between the two. "They arrested Dole," Ruth said. Maria stood in the doorway and felt the news move through her, not like a wave but like the gradual clearing of something fog-lifting, or a sound you had been so long accustomed to that you did not notice it until it stopped. She thought of Thomas. She thought of 14 months. She thought of how thoroughly she had refused to be beaten and how much it had cost her to maintain that refusal. "Thank God," she said, and her voice cracked on the second word, which surprised her because she thought she was past cracking. Ruth took her hands. "It's over, Maria. The trial isn't yet. But the worst of it, the not knowing, the land, the feeling of being—" Ruth stopped. "Helpless," Maria finished. "Yes, the worst of that is over." She told Noah that evening. He was in the paddock when she came out, working with a young horse that had been skittish since they'd acquired it in October. He listened to her without speaking, his hand moving slowly along the horse's neck, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "That's all. He looked at her over the horse's back. What else should I say? I don't know, something larger. It's a large thing. It is, he said. It's the largest thing. But sometimes the largest things only need one word. She looked at him standing there in the fading December light, patient and steady, and felt the love she had been managing and measuring and keeping at a careful distance do something decisive inside her chest. It was not a gradual thing in the end, or rather it had been gradual until this moment, and this moment was simply the point at which it finished being gradual and became undeniable. She loved him. She loved this quiet, complicated, careful man who had shown up at her door in October with information and a bruised jaw and a copy of David Copperfield and had stayed. She did not tell him then. She turned back toward the house and managed the knowledge of it for several more days, which was probably unnecessary but felt important. Christmas approached the way Christmas does in frontier towns, slowly and then all at once, with the dry goods store putting tinsel in the window, and the church planning its pageant and children becoming approximately ungovernable with anticipation. James, who had been reserved and watchful since his father's death in a way that made Maria's heart ache, came fully alive with the approach of the holiday. He made Noah a gift, a small carved horse, worked from a piece of scrap wood with James's own pocket knife, lopsided in the legs but unmistakable in intent, and presented it to him on Christmas Eve with the solemnity of someone bestowing something precious. Noah held the carved horse carefully in both hands and looked at it for a long time. "This is the best horse I've ever been given," he said. "It's not a real horse," James said, with the scrupulous accuracy of a child who does not want to be caught in an exaggeration. "Some gifts you can ride," Noah said. "Some you keep, this one I'll keep." James, satisfied, went to bed. Maria and Noah sat by the kitchen fire after that, and the silence between them was different from all the previous silences, warmer and more weighted, full of things that were ready to be said. "He loves you," Maria said. "James, he would not show you that horse if he didn't." "I know," Noah said. "It terrifies me a little. Because you might leave." He looked at the fire. "Because I might not deserve it." "Noah," she said, and using his first name was itself a statement which both of them noticed. A boy doesn't give someone his best work because they deserve it. He gives it to them because he sees them. Noah looked at her. The firelight was on his face and she could see everything in it, the long years of running, the slow, careful work of relearning to stay, the wanting that had been building in him as steadily and inevitably as it had in her. "Maria," he said, her first name, equally a statement. "I need to ask you something honestly." "Ask. Is what I think is happening actually happening?" She looked at him with the directness that had always been her most reliable quality. "What do you think is happening?" "I think I've fallen deeply in love with you," he said. "I think I've been falling in love with you since you opened the door with a rifle and refused to put it down. I think you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever met, and I think," he started again. "I think I would like to stay here, not in the barn loft, here, with you and James if you'll have me. But I understand if that's too much or too fast or if I'm reading it wrong, and I would rather ask honestly and be honestly answered than—" "You're not reading it wrong," she said. The words fell into the room and stayed there, clear and warm. "Maria," he said again, and stood and crossed the small distance between them and took her hand from her lap very gently, as if she were something he was allowed to hold but not yet certain of. She looked up at him. "I swore I would despise you," she said, "when they told me who you were, what they said you were. I know. I was entirely wrong." "I know that too," he said, "and I'm glad of it." She stood and was close to him now, close enough to see the particular gray-green of his eyes in the firelight. "It has not been a long time," she said. "It has been a few months." "A few months can be long enough," he said. "Time in the West doesn't measure the same as time in cities." "You know that." She did know that. She had lived more in the past 14 months than in several years of ordinary life, and the past 2 months more than the 14 before them. She put her free hand against his jaw, not the bruised side, the other side, and felt him very still under her touch, as if stillness were the thing he could offer to let her know she was safe. "I love you," she said. I did not plan it, and it has been inconvenient, and I am entirely glad of it." He brought his forehead down to rest against hers, very gently, and they stood that way for a moment in the firelight and the quiet house while Christmas Eve settled around them. He kissed her softly. She kissed him back with more certainty. When they stepped back from each other, both of them were somewhere between smiling and something deeper than smiling. "I'll speak to James," he said, "and I'll speak to Bennett about what's proper. I want to do this correctly." "Correctly," she said, amused. "I have not done a great many things correctly in my life," he said. "I intend to do this one right." January came in hard and cold, the way Kansas Januaries always did, with a north wind that found every gap in every wall and a gray sky that sat so low over the plains it felt like the lid of something. But the Grady farm, which the town was already beginning to call the Thatcher place in the way that towns adjust their language ahead of official events, was warm and busy, and full of the particular quality of life that happens when people who have been separately managing suddenly find they can manage together. Noah had spoken to James on the morning of the 26th, privately, man to man, in the paddock while they were feeding the horses. Maria had watched from the kitchen window, not hearing the words but reading the shapes of the conversation, Noah crouching down to James's level, James listening with enormous attention, the question Maria could see in James's small face. And then whatever Noah said that caused James to throw his arms around Noah's neck with the uninhibited force of a child who has received exactly the answer he needed. She had turned away from the window then because she was crying and she didn't particularly want to be observed doing it, even from a distance. Bennett handled the legal formalities. He told them that a brief engagement period was customary and sensible, and Maria agreed, and the brief engagement period turned out to be 6 weeks because they were both practical people, and 6 weeks was enough time to be certain, and to allow the town to adjust to the idea. The town adjusted to it in pieces. Some people were quick about it. Ruth Abernathy declared herself delighted, and began immediately planning what she could contribute to a wedding, with the focused intensity of a woman who has been waiting for something to celebrate. Jim Kowalski, the nearest neighbor, came by and shook Noah's hand and said that anyone who helped Maria Grady keep her land was all right by him, and that was the whole of his speech on the matter. Some people took longer. The church auxiliary took a cautious approach, requiring a demonstration of Noah's character over time before committing to approval, and Noah provided this demonstration with patient consistency, showing up at church every Sunday and helping without being asked when the roof of the community hall developed a problem in February. Harlan Dole's trial was set for March of 1883. The Cutter brothers had both agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. Marcus Cole, calculating the odds, had apparently advised Dole that a deal was preferable to a trial, and in February, Dole entered a guilty plea to charges of conspiracy and was sentenced to 15 years at the Kansas State Penitentiary at Lansing. He would not serve all of it, men like Dole rarely did, but he was removed from Sumner County and from the position of power that had allowed him to operate with impunity for years, and that was enough. That was the beginning of enough. Maria received the news of the plea from Bennett on a Tuesday afternoon in February. She went out to the paddock where Noah was working and told him, and he stopped what he was doing and looked at her and said, "Is it finished?" "It's finished," she said. He nodded slowly, and then he pulled her to him carefully, his arms around her, and she felt him exhale a long, deep, releasing exhalation that she understood was not just for today but for everything, for the 3 years of running and the weight of what he'd witnessed and the long, complicated road from Missouri to this paddock on this Kansas farm. "It's finished," he said into her hair. "And we're still here." "We are," she said. "We're still here." They were married on the 15th of March, 1883, in the Caldwell Methodist Church. It was not a large wedding. Ruth Abernathy was there, and Jim Kowalski and his wife, and Aldous Bennett and his wife, and the Reverend Horace Gill, who had known Maria since she and Thomas had first come to Caldwell, and perhaps 30 other townspeople who filled the pews with the cheerful practicality of frontier people who understand that celebrating good things is a community obligation. James stood beside Noah at the front of the church, wearing his best clothes and a grave expression that kept cracking open into involuntary delight. He had asked Noah 2 weeks before the wedding if he could be part of it, and Noah had said yes without hesitation. Maria came down the aisle on the arm of Jim Kowalski, who was the closest thing she had to a standing male figure in her life, and Kowalski delivered her with the solemnity of someone who takes the responsibility seriously. She was wearing a dress that Ruth had helped her make from good ivory wool, simple in line, and she had her mother's small pearl earrings, which were the only jewelry she owned that counted as fine. She was not thinking about being beautiful. She was thinking about being true, which had always been a better goal. Noah watched her come down the aisle with an expression that was entirely unguarded. She had learned to read his face by now, and she could see everything in it. The steadiness that was his fundamental quality, and beneath it, something bright and astonished, as if he was still slightly surprised that this was happening, that he was standing here, that this was his life now. She reached him and Kowalski stepped back and Noah took her hands, and she could feel that they were not entirely steady, which she loved, because it meant he felt it as fully as she did. Reverend Gill spoke the words that the frontier West had borrowed from older traditions and made its own, about love and partnership and the building of life in difficult country. And Maria and Noah said their vows in the clear, plain voices of people who mean what they say. When Reverend Gill said, "You may kiss your wife," Noah kissed her with a gentleness that held a whole year's worth of patience and wanting, and the small congregation made the sounds that small congregations make when something good happens. James, standing beside them, looked enormously pleased with himself, as if he had arranged the whole thing. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the Kowalski farm, the largest property in the immediate area, with a barn big enough for tables and the kind of food that appears when a community wants to mark something. There was fiddling, and there was dancing, and there was a great deal of Ruth Abernathy's cooking, and a reasonable amount of the whiskey that Jim Kowalski made in defiance of several local ordinances. Noah danced with Maria and with Ruth Abernathy and then with Maria again, and she leaned against him at the end of the last song with her head against his chest, and felt the music through him and thought, with a simplicity that surprised her because she was not a simple person, that this was happiness. This particular thing, this man, this music, this room full of people, this life that had come out of loss and stubbornness and an outlaw holding a courthouse door at dawn. She tilted her head up to look at him, and he was already looking at her. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I want to remember this exactly," he said, "the way it looks right now." "So do I," she said. Spring came to southern Kansas with its usual sudden extravagance, the prairie grass greening overnight, the wildflowers appearing in the low ground, the creek at the south end of the property running full and bright with snowmelt from somewhere north. Maria planted her kitchen garden, and Noah turned the fields, and James came home from school every day with the increased energy of a child who has shed winter's confinement. Noah had taken on work breaking horses for several ranchers in the county, which was well paid and suited him entirely, and which had the additional effect of re-establishing his reputation in the area as something other than a criminal. People who work with horses know each other's character through how they handle animals, and Noah handled every animal he touched with patience and skill, and an almost intuitive understanding that could not be faked. By April, the men who hired him were telling their neighbors that the Thatcher fellow was the best hand they'd had, and that was the kind of testimony that mattered in horse country. In the evenings, Noah and Maria sat on the porch as the light went golden over the flat horizon and talked about what they were building. Not just the farm, though the farm was real and demanding and satisfying, but the larger thing, the life. They talked about James and his future. He was bright and quick-minded, and Noah had taken to working through arithmetic problems with him after supper, in a way that had turned James from a reluctant student into an enthusiastic one, which had made his schoolteacher, Miss Adkins, comment to Maria that she didn't know what had happened at home, but it seemed to be working. They talked about neighbors, about the town, about the slow, complicated process by which Caldwell was trying to become a place where law meant something. They talked about the railroad coming further west and what it would change. They talked about the Kisham Trail and how the cattle drives were changing as the land was fenced and the old routes compressed, and whether that was progress or loss, and both of them thought it was probably some inextricable combination of both. They did not talk often about the past, not because it was forbidden, but because the present was so much more interesting, so much more alive. But sometimes, in the particular honesty of late evenings, they did. "I still think about Thomas," she said one April evening when the sky was that impossible dark blue that comes just before stars. "Not every day anymore, but regularly." "Of course you do," Noah said. "He was James's father. He was your husband for years. He would be strange to let go of completely. It doesn't trouble you." He considered this with the seriousness he gave to questions that deserved it. "It would trouble me if you had forgotten him," he said. "It would make me wonder what kind of love that was if it was that easy to leave behind. The fact that you carry him, it tells me you love with your whole self, which is exactly what I want to be loved by." She looked at him in the gathering dark. "You are a better person than you think you are," she said. "You've told me that before. I will probably keep telling you until you believe it." He reached over and took her hand on the porch railing, and they sat together watching the first stars appear over the Kansas plain, and the night settled over them like a blanket. Summer arrived, and with it a fullness of work that was its own reward. The fields needed tending, the horses needed working, the kitchen garden needed daily attention and produced, in July, such an abundance of tomatoes and squash and beans that Maria spent 3 days putting things up in jars, and still had enough left over to bring 2 baskets to the church for the community pantry. Noah built a new chicken coop in June, a proper one with good ventilation and predator-proof walls, which James decorated with carved wooden letters saying Grady Thatcher over the door, the hyphenation being James's idea and entirely non-negotiable. Ruth Abernathy came to dinner one Sunday in July and afterward, when Noah had taken James out to look at something in the paddock, said to Maria in the quiet of the kitchen, "You look different." "Different how?" "Like someone who isn't bracing themselves constantly," Ruth said. "You've looked braced for years, Maria, since before Thomas died, actually. You always looked like you were holding something back, waiting for something to go wrong." "You don't look like that anymore." Maria thought about this. She washed a dish and thought about it. "I suppose I did brace myself," she said. "I suppose I learned to. And now," she said slowly, "I still understand that things can go wrong. I'm not naive about that, but I don't feel like I'm waiting for it. I feel like I'm living forward instead of bracing backward, if that makes any sense." "It makes perfect sense," Ruth said. In August, Maria told Noah she was expecting. She told him on a Tuesday evening when James was at the Kowalski farm overnight, giving her the rare privacy of an empty house. She told him plainly in the kitchen over supper, in the direct way she told him everything important. She watched his face as the information arrived in him. He was very still for a moment. Then he stood up from the table and came around to her side and knelt beside her chair. She had never seen him kneel before anything, and the gesture undid something in her and took both her hands and said, "Are you well?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I'm healthy and strong, and this is not my first time, so I know what to expect." "Yes," he said, "but are you well? Are you happy about this?" She looked at him kneeling there, his hands around hers, his face fully open and completely unguarded, every bit of the man visible. "I am so happy about this," she said, "that I don't entirely have words for it." He brought her hands to his face and pressed them there, his eyes closed, and she felt him breathe. "I'm going to be a father," he said very quietly, as if testing the words. "You are already a father," she said, because he was, and they both knew it. "But yes, in this particular way also." He stayed where he was for another moment, and then he stood and pulled her gently to her feet and held her with a tenderness so thorough that she felt it all the way through. "I'm terrified," he admitted into her hair. "So was I," she said, "the first time. Thomas held me while I said that. Did it help?" "Very much." "Good," he said, and held her more firmly. They told James the following evening. He received the news with the particular combination of excitement and uncertainty that is native to children learning that their universe is about to be rearranged. He asked several practical questions. Where would the baby sleep? Would it be loud? Would it take his schoolwork time? And Noah answered each one with total seriousness. And then James said, "Well, I think it should be a boy because I already know about boys," which made Maria laugh for the first time since she could remember laughing at something entirely freely. Dr. Haverson, who kept an office on 2nd Street and had delivered half the children in Caldwell, confirmed the news in September and told Maria she was doing well and to keep eating properly and rest when she could. The last instruction being one Maria received with the polite skepticism she gave to advice that was theoretically sound but practically unworkable. The autumn of 1883 had a different quality from the autumn of 1882. Same land, same sky, same coming cold from the north, same orange and gold burning through the cottonwoods along the creek. But the year before, Maria had walked through autumn in the particular way of someone who has survived something and is not yet sure what comes next. This year, she walked through it in the particular way of someone who knows. She knew what the smoke from the kitchen chimney smelled like at 6 in the morning. She knew the sound of Noah talking to the horses before dawn. She knew the exact creak of the 4th porch step and the way the kitchen door caught in the autumn humidity and had to be lifted slightly to close. She knew the sound of James doing arithmetic at the table while Noah checked his work, the occasional debate over method that somehow never turned into argument because Noah was patient in ways that even she had not fully anticipated. She knew the weight of the life she had, and it was the right weight, demanding and warm and hers. Harlan Dole was serving his sentence at Lansing. The Cutter brothers were also serving time, considerably less, but enough to keep them from county for several years. Marcus Cole had taken his practice to Wichita, where presumably the money was better and the moral landscape was more welcoming to a man of his particular talents. Judge Whitfield had retired quietly without ceremony, in a way that suggested the retirement was not entirely voluntary, and the new judge assigned to Sumner County was a man named Arthur Reeves, who had a reputation for actually reading the cases before him. The land was theirs. The farm was producing. The horses Noah trained were bought by ranchers from as far north as Dodge City, and his name in that trade was becoming something that meant quality and reliability, words that, applied to a man, are worth more in the long run than any other kind of description. November brought the early cold and the preparations that cold required. Noah and James banked the foundation of the house against the wind, a job that involved a great deal of mud and several disputed decisions about technique, all of which were settled by Maria, who had banked more foundations than either of them and had opinions about method. The chicken coop was winterized. The horses were brought in at night. The root cellar was full of the summer's preserved abundance. On a Thursday evening in the middle of November, with the first real snow of the season just beginning outside the windows and James asleep in his room and the kitchen smelling of bread and coffee, Maria sat at the table across from Noah and looked at the man he was, this man who had walked into her life with a rifle pointed at him, and a reputation she had sworn would make her hate him, and felt the kind of gratitude that is too deep for comfortable expression. "What?" he said, because he could always tell when she was thinking something she wasn't saying. "I was thinking about the courthouse," she said. "About October last year, about walking up those steps in the dark." "Cold morning," he said. "Very cold, and I was so frightened, Noah, not about the hearing. I could manage the hearing. I was frightened about all of it, the land and James and the future and whether any of it was going to hold together. And you were holding the door," she said. You had every reason not to be there. You had every reason to ride west and keep riding, but you were holding the door." He looked at her steadily. "Where else would I have been? Anyone who had known you before that October would have told me exactly where you would have been," she said. "Which is to say, not there." "They didn't know me," he said. "Or rather, they knew the running version of me. The man who was afraid. You got the version that decided to stop." "I'm glad I got that version," she said. "So am I," he said, and reached across the table for her hand. The snow fell outside the warm house, and the fire crackled in the stove, and Maria thought about all the distances. The miles between running and staying, between despising and loving, between the woman who had climbed the courthouse steps alone, and the woman she was now, sitting in this kitchen, full to the edges with everything that had followed that door being held. The baby arrived in the first days of March 1884, in the way babies arrive on its own schedule, with its own absolute authority over the timing of events. Dr. Haverson attended, and Ruth Abernathy was there, and Noah was in the kitchen pacing the length of it with the focused intensity of a man who is very good at being patient about almost everything, and has now found the limit of his patience. James had been sent to the Kowalskis overnight and was reportedly checking for news every 15 minutes, which Mrs. Kowalski communicated through her husband, who came by mid-morning to see whether the situation had resolved itself. It resolved itself at 2 in the afternoon. A boy, solid and loud, and possessed of the full lung capacity that seemed to characterize the Grady constitution. Maria held him in the warmth of the bedroom, and felt the particular staggering love that is specific to new children, the love that arrives complete and overwhelming and does not require any time to develop, being already entirely there from the first moment. Noah came in when Haverson called him, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the two of them, Maria in the bed with the baby against her chest, and his face was something Maria would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was not a complicated expression. It was the expression of a man standing at the exact center of everything he had wanted. He came and sat beside her, and she put the baby into his arms and watched him hold his son with the same careful, deliberate gentleness that characterized everything he did, as if understanding from the first moment that this was something to be handled with absolute attention. "Hello," Noah said to the baby, very quietly, as if introducing himself. The baby, with the magnificent indifference of the newly arrived, made a small complaining sound and then settled. "He sounds decisive," Noah said. "He sounds like he knows his own mind," Maria agreed. "Which is either a blessing or a significant challenge. I haven't decided which yet." "Probably both," Noah said, and looked up at her with that full, unguarded face, and she put her hand against his cheek and he turned into it. They named him Daniel Thomas Thatcher the Thomas for the obvious reason, because Thomas Grady had been James's father and a good man, and deserved to be remembered in this family's naming, and Noah had suggested it, which told Maria everything she needed to know about the kind of man she had married. The Daniel was for Noah's father, who had lost his farm and his way, but who had, in the years before drink had taken him, taught a young boy to read and to respect a horse, and that was enough of a legacy to be worth naming after. James arrived home from the Kowalskis in the early evening and was brought in to meet his brother with the solemn ceremony the moment required. He examined the baby with careful attention. "He's small," James said. "You were small once," Maria said. "I find that hard to believe," James said. He reached out one finger and the baby wrapped an impossibly small fist around it with the automatic determination of the very young, and James's face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling on something that was essentially helpless adoration, though he would not have used those words. "He's all right," James said, with magnificent understatement. "He is," Noah agreed. Spring came again to the Grady Thatcher farm with its green extravagance, and Daniel grew in the way of healthy, well-tended infants, quickly, and with tremendous enthusiasm for all available food, and James grew in the different way of boys approaching 10, with lengthening limbs and expanding opinions, and an increasing ability to be useful in ways that actually mattered. Noah's horse work expanded. He had enough business by the summer of 1884 to be turning some ranchers away, and the money was steady enough that Maria began planning the addition to the house that they had discussed through the winter, a second bedroom for James, so that Daniel could eventually have what was currently James's room. The addition was built in August and September, with help from Jim Kowalski, and two of his hands and considerable input from James about where the window should face. Noah did most of the carpentry himself, in the evenings after supper, working by lamplight when he had to, and the quality of the work was what it always was when Noah worked on something he cared about, thorough and true, and built to last. Ruth Abernathy came to dinner regularly enough that her presence at the table was essentially assumed, and she had taken to bringing her mending and staying for the evening, which meant that Maria had adult company on the evenings when Noah had to make a late delivery of a horse to some ranch north of town. Ruth and Maria would sit by the fire with their respective work and talk in the comfortable shorthand of women who know each other thoroughly, and sometimes James would appear from his room with a question about schoolwork, and sometimes Daniel, increasingly mobile by the autumn of 1884 and interested in everything within reach, would demand someone's attention. There was an evening in November, Daniel almost 9 months old, James past 10, the first anniversary of Daniel's conception, if Maria had thought about calculating it, which she hadn't, when Noah came home late from a delivery to find the house full of warmth and lamplight, and the smell of Ruth's apple cake, and Maria and Ruth arguing companionably about the correct method for putting up apple butter, and James reading to Daniel from a picture book while Daniel periodically grabbed at the pages. And Noah stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment without speaking, taking in the full particular picture of it. Maria looked up and saw him there. She saw what was on his face. "Close the door, Noah," she said. "You're letting the cold in." He came in and closed the door, and Ruth said hello and handed him a piece of apple cake, and James reported on a problem with long division, and Daniel demanded to be picked up, and Noah picked him up and sat at the table with the baby on his knee and took the piece of cake and answered James's arithmetic question, and the evening went on in all its warm, ordinary fullness. Later, when Ruth had gone home and the children were sleeping and Maria and Noah were in the kitchen in the last quiet of the night, he said, "I stood in that doorway and thought about Missouri, about my father's farm, about what I thought a life would look like and how completely different the actual thing is from anything I imagined. Different good or different complicated. Different so much better," he said. "Different in ways I didn't have words for before." She sat across from him with her hands around her coffee cup and looked at him with the directness that had never left her. "I thought, for a long time," she said, "that losing Thomas was the thing that would define the rest of my life. I thought I would spend the rest of it managing the shape of that loss. And it defined a year," she said, "a terrible and necessary year. And then you came and defined something else entirely, and I think," she paused, finding the exact right words because she was always precise and this deserved precision. "I think what a life is layers. Thomas is a layer. Everything I built during that year of managing is a layer. And this is the layer that is happening now, and it is not a replacement for any of it. It is built on top of all of it, and I think it is the richest layer I have ever lived in." Noah looked at her from across the kitchen table in the lamplight of the only home he had fully claimed as his own since he was 17 years old. "Maria Grady," he said, using the name she had before him. "Maria Thatcher," she said, correcting him with a small smile. "Maria Thatcher," he said, "you are the most honest person I have ever known, and I love you with everything I have." "Good," she said. "I know you do, and I love you the same way." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and they sat that way for a while in the late November night, in the warm house on the land they had fought for and won, with their children sleeping in the next rooms and the fire burning low in the stove, and the whole great weight of the plains dark and cold and indifferent outside the walls, and inside, this, just this. The particular and sufficient miracle of two people choosing each other and staying, of a life built from what loss left behind, of a door held open at dawn and walked through, and everything good and hard and real and lasting that had followed. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was long but not unkind. Daniel learned to walk in February, with the unstable, determined progress of someone who has decided that standing upright is the only acceptable mode of travel, and intends to master it regardless of how many times the floor and the table leg intervene. He had Noah's eyes and Maria's stubbornness, which James declared was a dangerous combination and would require careful management. Noah declared that any child of Maria's stubbornness would be perfectly fine in the world and probably better than fine. Maria declared that stubbornness was not a family trait, merely a commitment to completion, and both of them looked at her with identical expressions of affectionate skepticism. By spring of 1885, the farm was thriving. Noah had trained enough horses over 2 years that his name was known in 3 counties, and he had been approached by a rancher named Henderson to partner in a horse breeding operation. Good bloodlines, good pasture, the kind of enterprise that could grow into something substantial. He talked to Maria about it for 3 evenings before deciding, going over the numbers and the risks and the opportunities with the thoroughness of someone who understands that the right decision requires full examination. They agreed. The partnership began in April. By summer, the first foals from Henderson's stallion and 2 mares Noah had selected were running in the south pasture with the magnificent confidence of young horses who have never yet been asked to carry anything. And Noah watched them the way he watched everything he cared about, with patience and attention, and the particular satisfaction of someone building something that will outlast the building of it. James turned 11 in the summer of 1885 and became, by general acknowledgment, the most competent child in Sumner County. He could do his own laundry, cook a simple meal, calculate the acreage of a field by walking its perimeter, and recite more of David Copperfield from memory than most adults had read. His teacher reported that he was 2 years ahead of his grade level and asked whether Maria and Noah had considered the secondary school in Wichita. Maria and Noah talked about this extensively. It meant James being away during the school year, boarding with a family in Wichita, which was not an experience either of them had asked for at 11. James himself, consulted with full seriousness as they had always consulted him, said that he would like to go but only if he could come home in the summers and only if he could bring his horse. The horse part was non-negotiable, apparently. They arranged it. James went to Wichita in the fall of 1885, horse included, and Maria stood at the edge of the property and watched him ride down the road with Jim Kowalski's eldest son, who was making the trip to Wichita anyway, and felt the particular complex emotion of a parent watching a child move toward their own future pride and loss and love, and the firm belief that this was right, all held simultaneously. Noah stood beside her and put his arm around her and said nothing because nothing was required. Daniel, watching from the porch with the bewildered expression of a toddler observing an incomprehensible event, said, "James," in the questioning tone of the very young confronting absence. "James will come back," Maria told him. "In the summer, James will always come back." And that was true. James came back in the summer, brown from Wichita sunshine and full of the half-formed notions and enthusiasms of a boy in the process of becoming something larger than he has yet understood. And the farm absorbed him back into it with the ease of something that has always known this is how it works, people going out and coming back, the center holding, the house warm, the horses running in the south pasture, the creek running bright in the distance. In the spring of 1886, Maria told Noah she was expecting again. He received this news across the same kitchen table where he had received the first such news, with the same stillness and then the same warmth, except this time he came around the table and held her without being asked, and she felt him smile against her hair. "Third time this kitchen table has held important news," she said. "The first time I sat at it," he said, "you had a rifle on your side and you were trying to decide if I was worth the risk. I decided you were. Best decision either of us made," he said. This child arrived in October of 1886, a girl this time, with Maria's dark hair and what would eventually become Noah's eyes, though at birth all babies' eyes have a provisional quality that doesn't commit to a color right away. They named her Clara Ruth, the Ruth for Ruth Abernathy, who received this information with the contained emotional explosion of a woman who has been hoping for something like this without letting herself hope for it. James came home from Wichita for Christmas that year and met his sister with the now practiced acceptance of a young man who has learned that family is an expanding rather than a fixed thing, and held her with the careful tenderness he had first learned holding Daniel. Daniel, at 2.5, was more ambivalent about Clara's arrival, but warmed to her with a speed that surprised everyone, particularly in the discovery that she found his antics hilarious, which was, for Daniel, essentially the only qualification for a good audience. The years settled into themselves the way good years do, full and various and not without difficulty, because difficulty does not leave when love arrives. It simply finds its proper proportion. There were hard seasons, a late frost in 1887 that took half the kitchen garden, a horse lost to colic in 1888, a winter when Clara was sick long enough that Maria and Noah both spent too many nights in chairs beside her bed, watching her breathe, willing her better. She did get better, with Haverson's help and her own evident stubbornness, and she emerged from that winter thinner and more determined and completely unchanged in personality, which was a relief. Noah and Henderson's horse breeding operation grew into something that people traveled to see, a reputation established through the quality of the animals and the training and the consistent fair dealing that characterized everything Noah did in business. He was known, by the end of the 1880s, as the best horseman in 3 counties, and as a man whose word was money, which was a particular kind of compliment in territory where trust was the currency that mattered most. James graduated from secondary school in Wichita in 1889 and came home for the summer with his diploma and a thoughtful expression and the beginnings of a young man's gravity. He talked about law school. He talked about it at the kitchen table and in the barn and on the porch in the evenings and during Sunday dinners with Ruth and the Kowalskis, and Maria and Noah listened to all of it with the full attention it deserved. "You should do it," Noah said to him, one evening when the topic had circled around for the 4th time that week. James looked at him. "It's expensive," he said, with the practical candor of a boy raised by a woman who kept careful accounts. "That's not a no," Noah said. "Your mother and I can manage the expense. That's not the question I'm asking. The question I'm asking is, do you want it?" James was quiet for a moment. He was 17 now, lean and dark-haired like his mother, with Thomas's steadiness in his eyes and something of Noah's watchfulness around the edges. "I want to make sure what happened to my father can't happen to someone else," he said. "Not just in Caldwell, in general. I want to understand how to fight it from inside the system instead of around it." Maria, listening from the kitchen doorway, felt something so full and mixed that she had to press her hand briefly against the door frame to steady herself. Thomas, she thought, he would have been so proud. "Then you should go to law school," Noah said, "and we will manage the rest." James went. He went to Kansas City in the fall of 1889, and Maria and Noah drove him to the train in Caldwell and stood on the platform and watched the train pull away, and Maria said, "He's going to be extraordinary," and Noah said, "He already is," and that was both true and enough. Clara grew and Daniel grew and the farm grew, and the town grew around them in the way that frontier towns grew in the late 1880s, changing shape, accumulating permanence, the wildness receding incrementally as fences and schools and churches and lawyers arrived in numbers sufficient to suggest that this was no longer a temporary place, but an actual one, a place with a future as well as a past. Maria turned 35 in 1889. She stood at the kitchen window on her birthday morning and looked at the yard and the fields and the south pasture where two of Henderson's foals were running, and Noah came up behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back against him. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That it is a good day to be 35, she said. "That I have never in my life been more in the middle of everything that matters." "Happy birthday, Maria Thatcher," he said into her hair. "Thank you, Noah Thatcher," she said, and turned in his arms and kissed him in the morning kitchen light the way she had been kissing him for 6 years, and hoped to be kissing him for 60 more, with full intention, with full love, with all the warmth of a woman who knows exactly what she has and chooses it every morning. Daniel burst through the back door at that moment with a level of noise disproportionate to his size, followed at a calmer pace by Clara, who was carrying a card she had made at the kitchen table with Ruth's help, decorated with wildflowers she had pressed from the summer. The card said "Happy Birthday, Mama" in large, determined letters, the M slightly unsteady. Noah disentangled from Maria with the practiced grace of a parent who has learned to make all transitions look deliberate, and crouched down to admire the card with Daniel, and Maria took Clara up and looked at the card very carefully and said it was the best one she had ever received, which Clara received with enormous satisfaction. Ruth Abernathy came for dinner. The Kowalskis came. It was the kind of evening that small, tight-built lives generate, not glamorous, not remarkable from a distance, but from the inside, everything. Food and talk, and the children getting gradually louder and then gradually quieter as the night went on, and the firelight, and Noah catching her eye across the room with that look that was entirely his, the one that said, "I see you, I am here, I am glad." She held it every time. She would always hold it. There were things that never got fully clean, and she knew that too. The land that Dole had tried to take was theirs, but the system that had allowed Dole to try was still running, imperfectly reformed, with new names in some of the old roles. The railroad was eating the open range, and the Kishom Trail had changed, and the lives of the people who had always lived on this land, before the settlers, were being compressed and constrained in ways that Maria watched with the same clarity she applied to everything, understanding the injustice even when the mechanisms of it were beyond her individual power to reverse. She taught this to her children, that their security did not mean everyone's security. That land could be taken and was being taken, and that the value of having fought for and kept your own ground was to understand what it meant when others could not. Noah taught this too, in his way, in the way he treated every person who came to the farm, in the fairness he brought to every transaction, in the simple fact of who he was, a man who had learned what it cost to be categorized and dismissed, and who had no interest in doing it to anyone else. James came home from Kansas City in the summer of 1891 as a lawyer. He was 20 years old, and he was Thomas Grady's son in the way that mattered, not in the face or the manner, but in the fundamental conviction that fair was a word with meaning, and that the law was supposed to serve it. He came home and spent 3 weeks on the farm and helped with the horses and played with Daniel and Clara, and sat on the porch with Maria and Noah in the evenings, and talked about everything he had learned and everything he intended to do with it. On his last evening before returning to Kansas City, where he had been offered a position with a firm that did civil rights work, he sat across from Noah on the porch in the summer night and said, "I want to say something." Noah waited. "When you came to our door in 1882, James said, I was 8 years old, and I thought you were the most interesting person I had ever seen, which my mother was trying to prevent me from thinking. And I thought you were a good person even though everyone was saying you weren't. I didn't have the vocabulary for it then, I just knew it the way kids know things. And then you stayed, and you were my father in every way that matters, and I want you to know that I know that, and I am grateful for it every day." The porch was quiet. The fireflies were coming out in the fields. "You've been easy to father," Noah said after a moment. "That is demonstrably untrue," James said, with his mother's precision and something of Noah's dry humor. Noah laughed. "No," he agreed. "You've been the best kind of challenge, the kind that makes you better." James looked at him. "Thank you," he said. "For everything, for coming to that door, for not leaving." "There was never any real question of leaving," Noah said. "Not after the first week. I think I knew that before you did." "I knew it before you did," Maria said from behind them at the door, and they both turned. And she stood in the lamplight of the doorway with Clara on her hip and Daniel leaning against her leg, and she was smiling at both of them with a love so thorough and unguarded that it was like the sun in the room, like the thing that makes all the other things visible. "You always know everything first," James said. "Yes," she agreed. "It's one of my best qualities." James left for Kansas City 2 days later, and Maria stood at the road again as she had stood before and watched him go, but this time without the grief of the first departure, because she understood now that going was part of staying, that James came back because he always came back, that the cord between them was not lessened by the distance. Noah stood beside her with Daniel holding his hand and Clara on his other arm, and they stood together on their land in the morning sun. And the road stretched south toward town, and the town stretched south toward the rest of the country, and the rest of the country stretched west toward the frontier, which was narrowing every year as the century turned toward its end. And all of it was happening, and all of it was changing, and right here, right in this spot. On this particular Tuesday morning in the summer of 1891, everything was exactly as it should be. "Come on," Noah said. "The Henderson foals need work." Daniel, immediately energized, said, "Can I help?" and was already pulling toward the paddock. "Carefully," Maria said, "and with your father watching every second." "Every second," Noah confirmed and swung Daniel up onto his shoulders and turned toward the barn. Maria stood for one more moment. The road was empty now. The morning was bright and the fields were full, and the horses were moving in the south pasture, and the kitchen door was open, and somewhere in the house, Clara had found something to bang on with something else, which was her primary hobby at this age. Maria breathed the morning air, clean and grass-scented, and full of everything that was real. She thought about dawn on a courthouse step in October of 1882. About the cold, the gray light, the weight of everything she had been carrying. About reaching the top of those steps and finding a man who had every reason to be somewhere else already holding the door for her. She had walked through that door. She had walked through it with everything she had, her stubbornness and her grief and her land and her son and her careful armor, and on the other side had been this. This farm and this family and this man and this life, layered and real and gloriously, unambiguously, unreservedly hers. She turned from the road and walked back toward the house, toward the sounds of Daniel and Noah and Clara and the horses and the ordinary, extraordinary business of the morning. And she did not look back, because there was no need to. Everything that mattered was ahead of her, right here, on this ground, in this life that had been built from the ruins of loss and the quiet revolutionary act of a man who chose to stop running and hold a door. Maria Thatcher went inside, and the door closed behind her, and the day was full and bright and open, and it was, by every measure that counted, everything.